are some of the social and concerns about privacy when it comes to use of social media?
There are a number of concerns. Before I come to privacy, I might indicate that there are the usual concerns about defamation, there are concerns about violation of copyright, there are concerns about inappropriate language, there are concerns about inappropriate content generally, for example, undesirable visuals, undesirable hate speech. There are so many of those issues. In terms of privacy, quite clearly the concerns would focus on unwanted approaches to people, also revealing information about people that they would not be comfortable being revealed. Um, this is not material that is necessarily defamatory, but material that people want to keep private rather than confidential. And in those circumstances, obviously, there would be concerns. There are also concerns, of course, about stalking, which can be the direct result of some types of interaction on social media. So there's quite a range of issues that stem from social media, from the use of social media in terms of privacy concerns.
So, how is legislation today around the world dealing with this use of social media?
In a very fragmented way, and also in a manner that is seen as not necessarily addressing all the concerns. But that has to do not so much with social media as such, as with the nature of law and technology, in the sense that you would have problems associated with social media that would be common to, say, material put up on websites. Um, Essentially, you're talking about problems with anonymity, which would be the single biggest problem. In other words, if somebody made a posting on a social media site anonymously, how are you going to track them down if you want to hold them accountable? That would be one of the biggest issues. The other issue would be, even if you were to track down the person making the posting, how do you deal with them legally? There's a question of jurisdiction. Where would you sue them? Uh, because they may be out of the country. Thirdly, even if you're lucky enough to be able to both identify the poster and uh, find the necessary jurisdiction to sue, what is the choice of law? In other words, the law of which country would apply to a situation of that kind? So there are so many legal issues, not all of which have been addressed. And it is difficult given the nature of law. There is no such thing as international law to deal with these kind of issues. At the end of the day, you're talking about domestic laws. You need to look at the laws in particular countries that do deal with these matters: defamation, contempt, intrusion of privacy, etc. So the law is effective, but only up to a point.
So you do mention defamation, slander, etc. So these existing rules for conventional media today, let's say Bhutan, how would they apply to social media use? Are they relevant? Can we use these laws to look at how people are using social media?
They definitely are relevant. You would use the same laws that apply to other media. So there is no such thing as a special law for social media, except, as I said, in areas like anonymity, where you would need to try to devise ways of tackling that problem. For example, one of the first things you do when you want to find out the identity of an anonymous poster is to find the IP address of the computer from which the posting was made. Now, you might need a law that would allow the national authorities to be able to track down the IP address. So, to that extent, you need special laws. But otherwise, if you're talking about substantive law, for example, if somebody has defamed another person, then you deal with that person who has defamed through the normal law of defamation, as applies to the newspapers, as applies to radio, to television, etc. To that extent, Bhutan already has some laws, and such as the penal code provisions on defamation, which would, as I said, apply across the board to all media. So if there was a social media posting which was seen as defamatory, and if it is possible to track down the person who made the posting, let's assume that the posting came from within Bhutan and it has been possible to identify the person who made the posting, then it is possible for the victim or the target of the defamation to sue that person in a Bhutanese court under the penal code. And the law will then take its course in exactly the same way as it would if the defamation had happened through a newspaper article.
Right now, the use of social media actually to the average person seems to be sort of lawless.
Mm-hmm.
People sort of like go online, there's a great openness
Yeah.
in sharing, in building community, but at the same time, there are also a lot of people who perhaps misuse this freedom and vent and go, share hate speech, etc., right? In the name of freedom of speech. Now, is this something that we have to come to accept, that social media, because of freedom of speech, we should just permit it to go the way it is?
Up to a point, unless you resort to censorship, which is very difficult, both politically and practically, and certainly legally as well, then you will have to accept a degree of laissez-faire in the way that people who use the social media behave. Clearly, freedom is important, but equally, one of the big criticisms that has emerged in recent months and years is that social media promote anarchy, which is, if you like, the other side of freedom. It also allows loud-mouthed, opinionated people to dominate public discourse on given topics. But many people have argued that that is a small price to pay for the overall enabling nature of the social media. In other words, social media do empower people in a way that the traditional media have not been able to do. Ease of access, cheap access, the fact that you don't need any special training or equipment to be able to make your point heard is clearly a positive thing about social media. But I think the answer probably lies in education. If people are educated to behave appropriately in their interactions on social media, then I think it'll go a long way. And particularly in societies like Bhutan, I think there is a lot of scope for public education, given that Bhutan is a small society, and given that there is still an adherence to certain values in a way that you do not find in all societies. So education, I suppose, is key in this area.
Are you familiar with Bhutanese Facebooks and tweets, and is there any particular thing that you'd like to mention, issue?
I have heard about the extent to which people get excited over developments that happen from time to time in Bhutan. As a lawyer, one of the things that I've heard recently is about the vehemence with which some people have argued for or against the verdict by the Supreme Court in the constitutional case. Now, that's a good example of public discussion, which needs to be encouraged. But on the other hand, it's also a good example of how things can go wrong, because if the postings on the social media were to exceed acceptable limits of criticism, then you verge into the territory of contempt of court. And the danger here is that the wider public may lose confidence in the judiciary as a whole if they are seen to be, if the judges are seen to be behaving outrageously, as some people I think have suggested. So clearly there are those kind of issues which need to be addressed. But otherwise, I would imagine that Bhutan is no different in terms of how people behave on the social media than most other countries. Are there any safeguards that can be used to, if you like, reduce the harmful effects of the use of social media? And there are possibly some actions that people can adopt to lessen the harmful effects. I would say, for example, that by allowing for password protection on certain sites, then at least what is being said will be confined to a closed group, so that there's no collateral damage as a result of the postings. Also, it may be possible in certain circumstances, although there are limitations, to have some of the discussions moderated so that the very harmful ones can be taken out before they are published. Um, there might be some room for disclaimers when postings are made, though legally the effect of disclaimers is debatable.
Do people actually read disclaimers and do they actually understand what
That's one aspect of it. The other is, even if you did have a disclaimer, it doesn't mean that you're completely free of legal liability. All that happens is that you can show your good faith by inserting the disclaimer in the first instance, and secondly, the amount of damages, if any damages awarded, would be reduced if there was a proper disclaimer. So there's some use of disclaimers, but I wouldn't say it's the magic bullet. And of course, it's always a good idea for people to review their postings before they are posted, because sometimes you write something thinking or not thinking what the consequences might be, and you discover later that it was inappropriate, and therefore you would rather not have posted it. Because remember that even if something is deleted from some of these sites, it is not deleted forever. It is perfectly possible for a copy to be found somewhere and for it to be revived. So to that extent, there's a risk, and therefore it might be a good idea for people to think very carefully before they post anything on social media.